So,
Okay.
okay, hello everyone. Team JUALS welcomes you to this very, very special evening. And a big thanks to everyone who's here with us, having taken time out of the last week of the year. But it's going to be a very, very memorable session, especially if some of your visions for the upcoming year includes authoring something. Then the session today, this is a perfect opportunity to shape some of your ideas that are in the rough, maybe. Welcome to On Being an Author. This is the first in episode in the series by Jadavpur University Arts and Literary Society, which is titled Tales and Techniques. The series is going to be an absolute delight for aspiring authors. Without further delay, I would like to introduce to you Radhika Oberoi, our esteemed guest speaker this evening. Before you hear from her, Radhika Oberoi is the author of two novels, Stillborn season in 2018 and of Mothers and Other Perishables in 2024, longlisted for the JCB Prize for Literature this year. She has also written book reviews. She has also written book reviews and essays for a variety of publications in India and abroad, including World Literature Today, Mekong Review, Business Standard, The Indian Express, Scroll.in, and Outlook Magazine. Her short stories have appeared in Words and Women, the Indian Quarterly Magazine, otherwise magazine, Usawa Literary Review. She has an MA in creative writing prose fiction from the University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom. Radhika, we warmly welcome you amidst us, and we cannot wait to hear from you about your experiences authoring not one but two novels while also delving into other forms of literary activities. Um, Over to you now. If you'd like to introduce a little bit about what we are doing here today.
Yes. Thank you very much for that warm introduction. I'm thrilled to be talking to all of you. I wish I could see all your faces, but perhaps I will during the course of this discussion. Um, since we're discussing books and we're discussing writing and writerly pursuits, I wanted to start this discussion by taking you through a scene from one of my favorite novels, Vikram Seth's A Suitable Boy. I have this, I have it in front of me. It's like a tattered tome, and I wanted to, talk about as well as read from one of the scenes in which it's actually a literary society meeting, and it seems very appropriate for our discussion. What happens is that Lata and Kabir are the two protagonists in this novel, amongst so many others. They attend a talk organized by the Brahmpur Literary Society meeting, and the meeting is presided over by old Mr. Nauroji. Now, Mr. Nauroji presents a poem that he has written to the society, and I'd like to read one stanza of that poem. Who a child has not seen drinking milk at bright breasts of mother, rag she wears or silk, love of mild mother, like rain-racked gift of clouds, in poet's words, mother, to thee I bow. So what happens after? So the poem continues in this vein, and Kabir and Lata exchange notes. So he stealthily sends her a note, and they decide to leave the meeting. Why do you think they leave the meeting? Apart from the fact that they are madly in love and want to steal some time together, why do you think they leave the meeting? Does anybody want to have a go at it? Do you want to, you know, hazard a guess at why they leave this meeting, this literary society meeting? Okay, so it's the astonishing quality of the poem. It's a bad poem. It's not well written. It's got very incongruous images, and it's not aesthetically appealing. So, which is why they decide to leave, and then they make fun of him, and which is what leads me to my next question: so what is good writing? What is good prose? What is good poetry? We'll discuss prose, of course, but what is good writing really? Is it a clear and precise style? Or is it sentence after sentence after sentence that takes you to another country, that transports you to a childhood memory, to a historic battle? Is good writing about aesthetic arrangements? Is it about an aesthetic arrangement of words and sentences? Why do we write anyway? Why do you write, Rishita? Do you want to sort of talk about it a little bit? Why do you write?
Okay, so I mostly, being a literature student, I mostly have to write because I have assignments. But other than that, the reason I always write is to have a certain congruence in my life, to neatly tie down things. I mean, we write everything, right?
Yeah,
We write to-do lists. We write about the mundane things we would want to do, and we write our marketing lists also. But then maybe at the end of the day, sitting down, we also frame our thoughts together and journal it, and then maybe
yeah,
depending on other faculties and whatever the kind of person you are, at times you push out something brilliant, something that is melodic, something a work of literature.
yeah.
So I write for a myriad of reasons, ranging
Okay.
from the two. Yeah.
That's interesting. And because you said you're a literature student, perhaps you've come across George Orwell's essay called Why I Write, in which he
Yes.
lists reasons why, compelling reasons to write. So I'll just read out
Yes.
a few. So his first reason was sheer egoism. We're all creatures of ego. So, sheer egoism, desire to seem clever, to be talked about, to get your own back on grown ups who snubbed you. So this I found really compelling, because who hasn't had grown ups in their lives that have snubbed us at some point in time or the other? Either it's, an overly critical parent, or it's a friend, or you've grown up with cousins that competed with you for attention. We've all grown up with grown-ups who have snubbed us. So this feels like a compelling reason. Then, of course, there is aesthetic enthusiasm, which is perception of beauty in the external world or in worlds and their right arrangement. Pleasure in the impact of one sound on another, in the firmness of good prose or the rhythm of a good story. And we'll discuss the rhythm of a good story a little later. So, pleasure in the arrangement of words, an aesthetic pleasure that you derive when you read something that's well written and not something that Mr. Naurji has created. So something that's not incongruous, but pleasure giving. Then another reason why we write is historical and political impulses, which again we'll discuss. We're all driven, we all live in a certain milieu, we're all driven by certain political impulses. We want to tell the truth about a certain situation or a certain matter that's churning in the city, but we want to do it in our own way. We don't want to simply narrate a story in a simple manner. We want to do it, we want to embellish it, we want to write it, we want to craft it. And that's something we'll talk about a little later. So I have worked in both advertising as well as journalism. And I wanted to mention the fact, and since you've asked that question and I have it in front of me, that both advertising and journalism influenced me as a writer. In advertising, when I joined on the cusp of the 21st century, we were very obsessed with writing good sentences. So we fretted over craft, over style, over the cadence of a sentence. And I had read the copy book when I was very young. And so I came across the works of Neil French and David Abbott. And they wrote long copy, a long copy ad which read like a great short story. And so that's what got me writing. Initially, I started off, of course, by writing ads, writing headlines, writing body copy, and making sure that each word is well crafted and there's not a word out of place. Then, of course, I graduated to longer forms of writing. Um, I think my preoccupations, much as Orwell discusses in his essay, were both political as well as historical. So I wanted to write, I wanted to capture a milieu, I wanted to write about what's going on in my city, but I wanted to do it in an impressionistic manner. So I wanted to do it with an attention to other details apart from really the facts. I wanted to write about what people look like when they're walking on a street, what they sound like, what the weather is like, what the quality of light is like. And that really is what enabled me to write longer forms of fiction. And also, that I wanted to mention that A Suitable Boy, for instance, is also about a political event. It's really about a new country. It's about a newly born country. It's about the first election that takes place after India gains independence. But it is told through the eyes of a mother who's desperately seeking a husband for her daughter. And it's also told through the destinies of four families. So these destinies intermingle, and interesting narratives are created because of that. And we get this huge tome called A Suitable Boy, instead of just a dry account of the first elections that take place in independent India. So do you want to ask me something?
Yes, that listening about what inspired your the prose parts that stuck with you. It was amazing. So you mentioned how you have been involved in advertising and journalism apart
Yeah.
from being a novelist. How did your experience in those fields influence your storytelling approach in literature, or when you began writing novels per se, especially when you authored your two novels in 2018 and 2024 respectively?
Yeah. So I've just discussed it, but I'll tell you again that, so reading great ads and also reading good journalism enabled me to create and write my own stories. And of course, I got to it much later. But I mean, initially I wrote a lot of ads. So I read a lot of ads. I read a lot of David Abbott. I read a lot of Neil French. I read Salman Rushdie, who was also in advertising for a long time before Midnight's Children and before his first book, Grimers, really. So Midnight's Children is this brilliant, patchy, digressional account again of the city of Bombay. It's told through the lens of nostalgia, and it's also got a lot of ads. A lot of ads pop up in that novel. If you're attentive to the narrative, you'll see that it's got a lot of ads. So my novels too, for instance, in Of Mothers and Other Perishables, I pay tribute to the 1959 Think Small campaign. It was created for the Volkswagen, which was this really dumpy looking, ugly looking car. The campaign was created by an ad firm called Doyle Dane Bernbach. And so my novel commemorates that campaign. So, of course, the working in advertising as well as some of my journalistic pursuits enabled me to write. I wanted to write creatively. I wanted to write with originality. I wanted to write prose that's firm, and I wanted to write prose that's stylish. I didn't just want to enumerate historical events. And so that helped me.
That's very interesting to know, because especially when you go into literary and academia right now, we learn about how the hierarchy of, placing prose that's written for being literary work, literature, and things that would not factor in, films, ads, everything. The hierarchy of importance is slowly broken. So it's wonderful noticing these small things, the importance of ads in literature. I would now like to move on to your university days. Maybe we are all university students here. You pursued your MA in creative writing, prose fiction from the University of East Anglia.
Yeah.
How did that academic experience shape your writing style and discipline? How should aspiring authors decide whether they need to pursue a traditional degree to, succeed as an author?
So the creative writing MA, it's not a very academic MA, but it is really a time where you can experiment with your writing style. You can experiment also with who you really are. So you may decide that, okay, I've decided to write this grand historical novel, or I've decided to write a deeply intensely political novel, and you want to write like 1,000 pages, but you end up writing a deeply personal novel, or you end up magnifying a small event in your life, like falling in love, your first crush. You end up writing perhaps a novella, a tiny little beautiful slender novella about falling in love with your neighbor. you know and so the creative writing MA really encourages that. It encourages adventures in writing. It encourages discovering what's within you and within your life. What is the material that you can excavate from your own life and put on the page? So that really helped me, because I was really attempting to do grand things, but I ended up really following my heart and writing what I felt strongly about. Another thing that the creative writing course does is that it introduces you to the craft of writing. So you become more aware as a writer about voice and style and points of view and how to format dialogue. And so you're more self conscious as a writer. You're not just floundering in the dark, but you know how to format a page, you know how to format dialogue. And there are, of course, workshops that enable you to hone your skills. Uh, Within these creative writing workshops, your work, you've presented either a short a 4,000, 5,000 word piece, and there you sit around a table, and your peers, your co-workshoppers, will review that piece. So you have to be a little resilient to that process, because all kinds of comments will come through. So you need to filter what is useful to you and what is something that does not you know does not work for you, does not enhance the quality of your writing. So if you happen to be overly sensitive, which I was, then you'll end up feeling a little disappointed with the way the workshop moves. But it also makes you more resilient as a writer. It also makes you resilient to the act of going back to the page, revisiting what you've written, editing what you've written, and perhaps rewriting it entirely. So, for those reasons, the creative writing course is extremely useful. However, some of my favorite authors don't have creative writing degrees. For instance, Arundhati Roy comes to mind immediately. She doesn't have a degree in creative writing, and she's written, The God of Small Things is one of my favorite novels. So you decide for yourself what you hope to achieve through this creative writing MA. If you really wish to hone your skills, if you really wish to become more attentive as a reader, and read discerningly and read better, then perhaps the course is for you. But if you feel that you're ready and that you're ready to put words down on the page and send it off to publishers, then that's really a call that you take about your life.
I hope that's, assuring for a lot of people who really, really dream of being an author one day to hear from you. So you mentioned narrative voice and how a degree shapes your narrative voice. And I mean, your narrative voice and your narrative style is something that goes through a transition. Speaking of that, from Stillborn season to of Mothers and Other Perishables, how much has your narrative voice changed? How can one find their own voice in the process of storytelling? And is it even possible to find and maybe stick to one?
That's a good question. It's a somewhat complex question, but Of Mothers and Other Perishables and Stillborn Season are both very different novels. So my first Stillborn Season was written in 2018. It's an episodic novel. It's more a novel in short stories, and it's got multiple narrators. So each chapter is different from the previous one. Each chapter has a different narrator, and I really experimented with style, with language, with diction, with syntax. So, one of the stories called The Prisoner has the urgency of telegrams. In another, there's a sub inspector who speaks with a peculiar diction, and I've introduced him in that way. So he speaks in that diction. I've attempted to capture that diction on the page. So Stillborn Season really is a very experimental novel. It's also set amidst the anti-Sikh riots that took place in 1984, immediately after Indira Gandhi's assassination. And to give the novel some semblance of order and some symmetry, it has a prologue and an epilogue, which begins and both are set in the garden in which Indira Gandhi was assassinated. So the prologue begins with this, it begins with this interview that never happens. There's a goodwill ambassador who's sitting under a peepal tree waiting to interview the prime minister, and she simply does not show up. And the epilogue ends with, again, a journalist, girl called Amrit, who grows up. And she imagines an interview in her head with the dead prime minister. So both the prologue and the epilogue are set in the garden in which she was assassinated. Of Mothers and Other Perishables, of course, is a very personal novel. I should probably mention that I lost my mother when I was 15 years old. I lost her to cancer. And Of Mothers and Other Perishables attempts to commemorate her life. But having said that, the woman in the novel is really not my mother, the disembodied voice. She's a disembodied voice. She's one of the narrators of the novel. I was also attempting to write a very contemporary novel again. So it's got parallel narratives. So this disembodied voice is one narrator, and in alternating chapters, you also have the story of her elder daughter called the Wailer. And she's named after Bob Marley and the Wailers. And she narrates in her universe, in her fictive universe, you get a glimpse of the riots, of the protests that take place after the introduction of the Citizenship Amendment Act, which was introduced in 2019. So the protests that take place in Delhi, find space in this narrative, in the Whalers' narrative, and seep into the rest of the narrative as well. And so it's got these, two twin narratives that are happening. One takes you back into the past, into the mother's very nostalgic universe of silk saris and vinyl records and her, a turntable, and she's got this beautiful ebony and gold sewing machine that she's fond of. So she takes you back into the 70s and the 80s, while the Whaler introduces you to contemporary Delhi. Now, through both novels, I was also to bring back George Orwell in this discussion, I was also attempting, these were my political and historical impulses. So I was attempting to capture a milieu, I was attempting to write about a political event, but I was doing it in my own way. I was doing it in a very impressionistic manner. I wasn't really concerned about facts and figures. I was more concerned about the setting of a scene, the lighting, the quality of light, the the scar on somebody's face, the pattern on a sari. I was interested more in very, very impressionistic details. So that really is about both my novels.
That is, I mean, frankly speaking, it must take a lot of thought and a lot of hard work to put so much into one piece of writing. It's really, I mean, a brilliant craft. There's really no way to, put it somehow else. So, could you tell us about the writing process for your novel of Mothers and Other Perishables? What are some approaches that have or have not worked for you in the past, and is there something that you really would recommend?
Okay, so of Mothers, because it's such an emotional novel. It's emotionally dense. It was written during the coronavirus pandemic, and so the lockdown was an ideal time to rummage through old cupboards and to look at old letters and old photographs. And all of those images have seeped into the narrative of the novel. It's strewn with images, as I've just mentioned, silk saris and vinyl records and a turntable. And this was because the coronavirus pandemic created a very melancholic environment, both at home as well as in my mind. I was constantly melancholic. I was constantly receiving bad news. The news was terrible all the time, and that led to the specific style and vocabulary of this dead female narrator. That worked for me. I think that environment, while it was a very claustrophobic environment to be in, you couldn't step out, and that worked for me. That I attempted to capture that claustrophobia in the prose. And what didn't work, since you've asked about what worked and what didn't really work, is perhaps telling myself that, okay, today I'll write 1,000 words and I'm going to stick to this 1,000 word count every day, because that really doesn't happen. Sometimes you bleed on the page, and sometimes the words don't come out right. Sometimes the words are just very stilted or borrowed from somebody else's writing, or just plain dumb, and you just feel that I want to write better and I want to create something that's original. So you need to go back sometimes to what you've written and need to revisit it and rewrite it perhaps. And that really is a long process. So the book took about 2.5 years to write, and I gave up this ambition of writing 1,000 words a day, because if I had done that, it would have come out much sooner. But I revisited paragraphs, I revisited pages, I edited, and I painstakingly created my sentences and my universe. So, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it absolutely does. Having said that, do you have any advice for people who are planning to publish their work for the first time?
Yeah, I mean, I have borrowed advice from Hilary Mantel and Zadie Smith, which I'll get to. But I wanted to say that, because I mean, I just think it's a bit tiresome to give advice to bright young people. Who wants to hear advice? It's a bit condescending to tell you, do this or do that. But I just wish for you to perhaps examine and excavate your own lives or your soul. All our souls are bursting with stories. We're all bursting with things to say and things to tell. And sometimes these inarticulated stories appear in a sigh or in a gesture or in a mood or in the twinkle of an eye or in the hammering of our hearts against our chest. So if you can give those unsaid stories a language, a syntax, some punctuation, and create your own little fictive universe, then you have a very original story to tell. Having said that, since I mentioned the greats, I just want to read out Hilary Mantel. She has said that a little arrogance can be a great help. The most helpful quality a writer can cultivate is self confidence. Arrogance, if you can manage it. You write to impose yourself on the world, and you have to believe in your own ability when the world shows no sign of agreeing with you. So don't let anyone muzzle you or tell you that this should be your style or this is how you should write. So just be a little arrogant, impose yourself upon the world. I don't mean that literally, but I mean that in your art and in your craft, you need to be, originality will only come if you're very individualistic. So you need to be individualistic in your art and on the page. Zadie Smith, she's one of my favorites, and she says, don't romanticize your vocation. You can either write good sentences or you can't. There is no writer's lifestyle. All that matters is what you leave on the page. So, a lot of writers, they feel that if they wear a lot of black, or if they have this really narcotized lifestyle, full of, you're oozing narcotics, your hair is disheveled, your breath stinks, then you're an artist. But that doesn't really work. What really works is if you brush your teeth and get to that desk and punch out those words. So that is something I've experienced firsthand, that there's some amount of discipline that's required. So you can't say, oh, I'm an artist, so today I'm going to stay in bed until say 2 p.m. and then get up and languorously go to the bathroom and come out and then, maybe, write a few words here and there. That doesn't work. What works is some amount of discipline, getting to that desk, punching out a few words, and then of course writing more and writing better. So that Zadie Smith, she also said, leave a decent space of time between writing something and editing it. So it's just something that you look at, in retrospect. If you've written a page and you go back to it the next day, there'll be certain words and phrases that will jump out, which will seem incongruous or seem not aesthetically appealing, and you'll erase them and you'll put new words over there. So that whole process is really important, and that distance between writing and editing is really important.
Have you ever looked back at some of your past writings and maybe thought about how you could have done certain things better? You just spoke of how, editing is really important, and I suppose one has to be conscious and one has to train themselves to be conscious that
Yeah.
way, and maybe that comes with time. But then perfection is also the enemy of progress, right? How should aspiring authors deal with their insecurities, and does it take a lot of time to cultivate this self where you can sit and edit without affecting your writing self in a certain way?
Um, that's two separate questions. So you can cultivate a self that enables you to edit. So you become this editor and you put on your editor's hat and decide to edit. But before that, you need to become a fully honed writer. And to become a writer is a bit of a messy process. I wish I had been a little less obsessed with perfectionism and a little more disciplined, because I have also whiled away time and not really put down, words on a page, and also been obsessed, then, gone back and edited, and so not made any progress on a particular day. But if you can tell yourself, again, if you can excavate your life for material, I think that's the best way, because only your life will be your life. Your life cannot be replicated in someone else's universe. So what you create from your life will be utterly original. Excavate your life for material, punctuate well, brush your teeth, get to the desk, and type out those words, and you will have something worth sending out to publishers. But it's really about cultivating that little bit of discipline, and that little bit of and also, yeah, I mean, I think you should also read a lot. Perhaps read extensively, and read writers that you're uncomfortable reading, or that you're not familiar with. Learn a new language. All of this helps with your own writing.
That gives us a very, very specific to-do list to follow. But yes, it's brilliant advice, really. Your
There,
short
Sorry,
stories.
I'm interrupting you. There are
Oh,
two
no.
more authors. Leo Tolstoy said he suggested writing in the morning because that's when you're freshest. That's up to you, of course. I mean, this is not a didactic list. It's just these are just suggestions. He suggested writing in the morning. And Muriel Spark, she suggests getting a cat, because cats can be really playful and tranquil, and that tranquility and playfulness then seeps into your work. And she found it helpful. So it's just a suggestion I'm throwing out. Get a cat.
That is the best of suggestions. So we have a raised hand, and I'm hoping we have a query.
Yeah.
Yes, Ajala, please.
Uh, yes, this is an extension of the last question. So I was thinking, how would you deal with the sense of perfectionism that you just mentioned after your words are out in public, after it has been published, and now there is, I'm hoping that I'm like, this is the possibility that I'm thinking about, that like it cannot be edited now. It is just out, and people need to the author needs to accept that version of the self that they don't really agree with anymore. Has this happened to you, or do you have any plans that how you deal with this?
Do you mean that have I looked at something that I've written and winced and felt, oh my God, did I really write that? And it's not
Could
good.
be,
Yeah,
sure.
that should happen in advertising. It's called divine discontent, that you look upon your previous work and tell yourself this could have been better in so many ways. I choose, once it's out, I choose not to look at it again because I choose to move on to something new. What I intend with every piece that I write is to intend to make it different from the previous one. So I don't want to repeat myself. I prefer to move to like a new subject or move to something more compelling than what I've already covered, a new city, a different landscape, a different milieu, perhaps a historical novel, or even a poem, or even an essay. Just move away from what you've already done and move to something fresh, and that will lend itself, it will acquire its own vocabulary and syntax and style. So I prefer not to look at what is already out and what is already published. I hope that answers you to
Yeah,
some
so
extent.
that's a habit that you had to consciously cultivate, right?
Um, Yeah,
Or
I
was it?
haven't. See, I've only written two novels, and
Yeah, sure.
I've written a bunch of essays, and I've written a bunch of essays and short stories. So sometimes I look back. Sometimes you look at something you've written, and its maturity and its depth also surprises you because you may have written it when you were very young, and it still resonates as deep or insightful. And then you can, sort of. Treat yourself to something or tap yourself on the back and say that you did a good job of it. So it's not always there. You don't always have to be self-deprecatory. That's what I'm saying. It's not helpful to be so self-deprecatory, and that's also what that's also what Hilary Mantel says, that be a little arrogant, impose yourself upon the world, say that you're a good writer, don't proclaim it to the world, tell yourself you're a good writer, and get down to the business of writing, essentially.
Thank you for that answer.
Okay, so your short stories, Radhika, have appeared in Words and Women, the Indian Quarterly magazine, and Otherwise magazine. How do you approach writing short fiction compared to longer works? Should beginners start by writing or working on shorter projects before tackling the enormous task of writing a novel?
So, short fiction is far harder to write than a longer novel because within, in a short story, you need to convey a lot more. And the canvas is far more, it's smaller, it's more narrow, it's far more intense. So you need to be able to sculpt. Are you prepared to sculpt right at the outset of your writing career? I don't know. But I can suggest that, some of my favorite short story writers is Anton Chekhov, who wrote The Lady with the Dog. The Student was one of his favorite short stories. Now he was fundamentally gloomy, and his characters were very plausible, and he was also very focused on impressionistic details. So he wanted to convey sensory details about a day or a particular character rather than just a summary of events. And his writing is that some of his stories are extremely languid and deceptively simple, and you enjoy them because there's a certain insight into human life. That some of them are very tragic, and insight into the social milieu of that particular era. Then I also simply love Laurie Moore's stories. There's How to Talk to Your Mother, which is really in, it goes backwards in chronological order, and it's brilliant. So she experiments a lot with structure. There's another story called How. There's a collection called Self Help, which is one of my favorite collections of short stories. Laurie Moore is one of the most brilliant short story writers I have encountered. Then, of course, there's Alice Munro, and who writes so evocatively about family and life, and her stories are so full of undercurrents, and they're also landscaped so beautifully. So Alice Munro is, of course, worth reading if you're attempting to write short stories. And I also recently read Mahareen Sohail's. She's written a short story called Sisters, which is really stunning. It's got this very unusual format. It's got these little snapshots, and it's got subtitles that read like tiny biographies. For instance, her subtitles read Sadia as newborn. So Sadia is the sister protagonist in the short story. Sadia as newborn. Sadia as afterbirth. So when you're writing a short story, you can experiment a lot with format, with narrative style, with characters, and also with chronological order. A lot of short stories move backwards. They start with they start with the climax of the plot, and they end up telling you how that really happened, how it all began. So it's interesting, isn't it? There's also Naomi Wood. She's written a collection of short stories called This Is Why We Can't Have Nice Things. And that's really about women in their 30s navigating life, motherhood, careers, and also seeking kinky pleasure along the way, So she's worth reading. She writes brilliantly well. She's also deceptively simple, but she's a brilliant, brilliant writer. But, I think that if you're beginning to write, I think you should just read a lot of, be diverse and varied in your taste. Read a lot of short stories, read novels, and then decide. I mean, that question: are you willing to sculpt so soon, or do you want like a wider canvas for your work? Because a novel will offer you wide canvases. It'll offer you, the scope to simply sort of just it'll offer you an expansive landscape for you to experiment with.
Yes. Okay, so you know how lifestyle, especially in the 21st century and post social media, is performative, and people want a certain lifestyle, and they have a vision, they have an aesthetic vision, and they have a clearer vision than any other time period now. So, speaking of that, has traveling and living in different places influenced you meaningfully as an author?
Yes, it has. To be very simple in my answer, it definitely has influenced me, even though I haven't written about those places directly. I don't really, I know that lifestyle is really important. People post everything now on social media. I don't do that, so I'm selective about my posts. I have a very small Instagram following, and I've only become more active on Instagram now because of my new book and because I wanted to promote it a little bit. But otherwise, I think it's important to try, to travel in privacy and to travel with people that you love, and to really value that experience because it creeps into your work. So I've lived in Norwich, and its cobbled streets and its beautiful churches and its a whiff of writerly greatness has seeped into my narrative. I've also been to a small town in Germany called Osnabrück, which has this really miniature, doll's house. Almost, it's almost like one elongated doll's house. So that miniature aspect of that town has crept into some of my work. Then I've lived and worked in Singapore for a bit, and so the glitzy advertising culture of that place, and Little India and its markets, its Buddhist temples, all of that influences a particular scene, or the light and quality of a scene, or a setting, or the texture of a particular scene is definitely impacted by the places that you've traveled to. Even within India, if you've traveled to, say, Coorg, or if you've traveled extensively along the coast, the coastline and the waves and the shorelines and the clouds, all of that then help fill up a scene in an interesting manner.
That was really interesting to hear. Well, I hope, especially for the writerly spirit, I really hope we can travel. And I mean, traveling is always amazing. It's especially amazing if you are a writer.
Yeah.
So everyone's talking about AI nowadays. People are using AI generative chatbots like ChatGPT and Gemini as writing aids, right? How does AI affect you personally as an author and the idea of authorship as whole, maybe?
So, I've never used generative AI at all. And I know that, and I've read a bit about it, and I know that a lot of authors have even clamored against it. They've even filed copyright infringement lawsuits against OpenAI. But, Chat GPT, for instance, how can it ever replicate the brilliance of a Salman Rushdie sentence, or of Zadie Smith's universe, or any of these? It cannot replicate brilliance and inventiveness. And to prove that point, or to demonstrate it, I'd like to read from one of my favorite novels again, Midnight's Children. I have a very tattered copy of it because I bought it, I think, in 1998. And I'd like to read a passage. It describes this boatman Thai, Kashmiri boatman Thai, who simply does not have a bath and he stinks. And so I'd like to read this description if you don't mind.
Of
Um,
course, absolutely.
Meanwhile, the boatman Thai had taken his unexplained decision to give up washing. In a valley drenched in freshwater lakes, where even the very poorest people could and did pride themselves on their cleanliness, Thai chose to stink. For 3 years now, He had neither bathed nor washed himself after answering calls of nature. He wore the same clothes, unwashed, year in, year out. His one concession to winter was to put his chuga coat over his putrescent pajamas. The little basket of hot coals which he carried inside the chuga in the Kashmiri fashion to keep him warm in the bitter cold only animated and accentuated his evil odors. So, which generative AI tool can capture or can sketch Thai with such brilliance? Tell me that, you know. So, I don't think generative AI will ever replace human authors and human writing, thankfully.
Yes, we have another question. Please go ahead with it.
Yeah, it's me again. Hello. So I was thinking that the point that you mentioned about brilliance, of course, that is something I also believe. But do you think that people are like, this is, I'm talking about a pre-AI era when it was not as popular. It has been there for a while.
Yeah.
Do you think that people they have been obsessed with the teleology or the end product, and they don't really focus so much on the process that makes the act of writing or any form of art so special? Like, are we really caring about what comes out at the end, something tangible, and not all the other things that goes into the process? That I think that also makes the human touch so special, even when it's not sometimes seemingly superficially observable.
Yeah. So, are you talking about the process of writing and how generative AI intends to enhance it? Is that what you're
No,
saying?
it's AI. It's a statistical model, right? So there is no process like human process.
Yes.
It's
So it
yeah.
cannot replace you. Absolutely. So generative AI is, it's a cold tool. It's meant, I mean, some authors may use it to enhance their sentences, but I think that the messy process of writing a sentence or of writing a short story is really important for the story to have depth and for it to resonate with other human beings and for it to resonate really with other human experiences. When we read a passage from, say, Salman Rushdie or anybody else, Alice Munro, for instance, how come it is that I'm sitting in India and I'm reading about a housewife in Toronto and I feel that, oh, her life resonates with mine? That's because she's managed to catch certain insights about human life and experience and managed to tell them really well. And that I don't think any generative AI tool can replicate. So that the messy process of writing a sentence becomes really important to the process of becoming a writer.
Right, right. Thank you.
Yes, so I have few other questions. I will get along with it. It's just the last couple. So, did you over the years develop certain writing rituals, such as writing or even scribbling random words and phrases at a fixed time, maybe, or doing something really specific before sending a manuscript out for publication? If yes, do you believe these rituals helped you develop discipline as a writer and further your career in some manner?
So, I don't have specific rituals, but I can just tell you what I love to do when I'm working on something. I love to go for a swim. I love to swim, and sometimes when I'm swimming, a scene will appear in between laps, and I'll be able to resolve a certain creative question that, or resolve a certain writer's block or move on in a story. So I love to swim and I love to take long walks. I love to ramble, and sometimes with my phone camera I capture whatever I see. So like a very dull, mundane moment, I capture that. It's either a street vendor or a mother with her child, or just a lamp, a street lamp. And this is really not for sharing on social media. It's a very picturesque database that I've decided to create for myself. And sometimes that helps me enhance. So the tools that I use really are not AI, generative AI, but my own phone camera and my own exercise regime that helps me write better, I think, because I go back to my own little database and create my own stories from the images that I have culled out from daily life. So I don't really have too much of a ritual.
That is amazing to hear. And you know how people have this curating a mood board kind of thing.
Yeah.
This is just going back and doing it from the scratch. It's amazing. So, yes, we have a raised hand. Please go ahead with your question.
Hi.
I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Okay. Hi. I was wondering to ask you about uh, how do you juggle different ideas during the process of editing? Because for me personally, the process of editing becomes it becomes a different stage where I am writing new drafts, and then it becomes very paralyzing because then I'm I am getting new instincts to write different things or write the same thing in different ways, or maybe I have a new idea, or maybe I'm trying to follow a rule, or maybe I'm trying to break certain rules so that I can think that okay, I can break rules because I have some ability, and so all of these things can then block me from actually getting something out. So
Uh, if I've got you correctly, you're talking about the process of editing. I can hear
yeah.
my own voice being echoed back. Is that normal? Just
Oh, I'm sorry. Wait, I'll mute myself.
yeah. So, editing, ideally, editing should be left for the last, after you've finished your manuscript or your short story or your poem or whatever it is you're attempting to write. And if during the editing process you want to change something drastically, then that only means that you're not convinced about what you've written. So editing should really be about enhancing and about sculpting and about turning the story into this really well sculpted, this muscular piece, and not about changing it drastically. Because if you're changing it drastically, that means you're going back to the drawing board, as we say. You're rewriting, and that's a different writing project altogether. And if that's happening, then perhaps you're not convinced about what you've put on the page, and that's okay. I mean, if you're beginning and you're starting out and you're experimenting with several ideas, I think that's a great thing. That means you've got a rich interior world, and you've got several ideas floating around in your head, and you're finding the best way to articulate them. And that, I think, is really important for a writer, to not get stuck that, okay, no, this is going to be a historical novel, so I must look up, research that era brilliantly well, and then just write a historical novel. That historical novel could turn into a love story, and that's something we've discussed in the past as well, that the creative writing MA could help you do that okay, you really want to intellectually write a historical novel, but what you really feel for is the girl you fell in love with when you were in school, and you want to write about her. So that quality of experimenting is very important. But when once you've reached an editing stage, then I think to go back and to change something, to me, is sounds a bit dangerous. I wouldn't want to do that to my work. I would want to just edit it and then move to something new, you know. So is there any other? I hope that's answered you adequately.
Yeah, I think I get your point. I hope that the more I engage with writing, that I will internalize it myself as well.
Thank you for that question and the answer, Radhika. So, finally, for a writer who is just starting out, because I know there are so many of us like that here today, and who are looking to publish, is there some advice that you would like to present for us? I mean, I'm again asking for advice, but yes, this is specifically about people who are going to publish in digital magazines and websites. Should they be selective regarding where their work appears? Is that something that people who are starting out should think about?
So, the digital magazine is an interesting space for you to send out your stories to. And I think that you should perhaps read these digital magazines and read the content that they're putting out. If it's original and fresh content, if it's well edited, and if it's proofread well, and there are no typos on the page, then you can consider sending your work out to that digital magazine. You don't always have to look out for very well known names on their pages, because you don't have to do that at all. What you should consider is the quality of writing, and the quality of editing. And if the quality of writing is fresh and original and appeals to you, and if the editing is good and you don't spot any typos on the page, then go ahead and send your piece to these magazines. That does not mean you shouldn't be selective. It just means that you should be discerning and careful. um, you know that's all I have to say about
Yes,
digital.
that answers the question, but this marks the end of all the questions I had for you. But now I would like to ask the audience if there's something you would like an answer to from Radhika. Please go ahead. You can raise your hands and then we will just start with whatever you have. Meanwhile, because we are almost at the end of an hour, which was our stipulated time. Thank you so much for your time, Radhika. It has been amazing. It was a really illuminating session for all of us. Yes, we have
The pleasure.
something in the chat box.
Yes,
Would you like me to read it out for
please
you?
do. Please, if you can. Yeah.
Yes. So, have you ever felt overwhelmed after completing a certain writer? That's a really interesting question.
Yes, I feel overwhelmed all the time and about everything. So after completing Of Mothers and Other Perishables, I felt overwhelmed because I felt, have I done justice to the story? Have I done justice to the characters? Have these characters lived out their destiny on the pages? Also, have I done justice to my mother, whose life I was attempting to commemorate? What would she have thought had she read this novel? Would she have enjoyed it? Would she have said that the voice of the dead woman, this is, it's not so great, it's not my voice? Would she have been critical of it? I don't know. So I feel very overwhelmed. I also feel sad. It's almost like, this project, this live project, is finally over, and it's going to be out in the world, hopefully, and so you're letting go. So it's almost like a farewell. So I feel very, very melancholic after a novel is done. After Of Mothers and Perishables was done, I was quite lost for a while. I didn't know what I immediately wanted to turn to another writing project, and there was nothing else. I wasn't inspired enough to work on something else, and I still wanted to read, and I was still caught in that universe of Mothers and Other Perishables, in those characters, in that life, in that landscape. So that prevented me really from moving ahead. But now that there's a certain amount of time and distance, and that the book is out in the world, I can safely move away from that and create something new. So that sense of being overwhelmed um, always happens, and I think it's a good sort of feeling, because I mean, if you're feeling overwhelmed while writing, then I think you need to take a break from the writing. You need to be able to do something that rejuvenates you and then get back to the page. But after finishing a project, if you feel overwhelmed, or if you feel perhaps not just overwhelmed but sad and melancholic, then that's quite natural.
Yes, this is completely understandable. And after a long project, I mean, of course. So we have two questions from Taijashi Koyal and then Somojit Paul. You can go ahead. So, Taijashi, if you would like to, please, you can ask your question.
Hello,
Hi.
I would like to ask you, how do you deal with criticisms after publishing a book?
That's a really good question, and I'm an extremely sensitive writer. I'm assuming a lot of writers are very thin-skinned, so you don't deal with criticism. You simply shut yourself off from it. That's my way of dealing with it. Sometimes you read a review in which you feel that the reviewer never understood what I've written, or the reviewer hasn't read the book entirely. And how could they say? Thankfully, that's not happened. I think Off Mothers received some glorious reviews, but the occasional review will be very condescending, or it'll it will be very deprecatory, and you wonder if the person has actually read the book, but then you decide to move on and you decide that this is not who you are. You can't let reviewers, you can't let criticism define yourself as a writer. Um, you can't let it constrain you, or you can't let it inhibit you from writing your next work. And also, I feel it's important for writers beyond a point not to seek external validation constantly. That validation should come, it should come perhaps from a few good people. It should come from not your family or not your mother, who will be overly fond of what you've written or overly critical, but from a few good critics, a few good reviews, perhaps a prize nomination, and that should be enough validation. And you move to the next project that you have at hand. Because if you're constantly caught up in who's saying what and who's being critical of you, then you're simply caught up in that and you're wasting time and you're not moving on and you're not getting on with the writing.
And there's also another question. Everybody has different interpretation. So, what you've written and another person is viewing it as something different, then how do you deal with that?
I think that what happens when you read a novel is that different people will have different meanings will emerge for different people, and that's okay. That means that the novel is rich and layered, it's multi-layered, and it sort of resonates with a lot of people. So I may read a page and decide this is about a certain character and about a certain character's predicament. You may read the same page and feel no, that it's not about this character, but it's about the other, the minor character, and that's quite okay. In literature, we aim to discover different nuances of meaning from a page, and I think that the more meanings we decipher from the page, the better the book is. So it's important to have different strands of meaning coming through, different nuances coming through. It's important to have different interpretations of the same page.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you so much, Radhika. So now, Somajit Paul, if you would like to, please go ahead.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Hi, ma'am. I
Hi.
really love the phrase the messy process of writing a sentence.
Thank you.
Uh, I am a messy person and I write best when I'm feeling emotional.
Okay.
So, the problem is I don't always have time to write when certain kind of emotion or inspiration strikes.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm finally sitting down, the feeling is gone and I'm stuck. Uh, I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
force myself to write on a schedule.
Yeah.
But due to my messy habits, I'm not writing enough these days. So, could you please suggest ways for me to write more consistently without sacrificing my emotional spark, that creative spark?
Well, it's interesting that if you have an emotional spark, if you're a messy person, you're dealing with difficult emotions, then writing it down sometimes helps. But that's a different kind of writing. That's a more dear diary kind of writing, and it's not really novelistic. When you're attempting to write a novel, or when you're attempting to write a short story, there's a certain structure that you give to that novel or short story. And to bring back the creative writing MA, I think the creative writing MA also attempts to make you more self-conscious as a writer, so that you don't fall into that dear diary trap. All of us can get back home in the night and open a diary and really rave and rant into that diary, but that's not writing. So if you're feeling emotional, I think that those, I think, are the benefits of a diary. If you're feeling terribly emotional, if you're feeling stuck, then bring those emotions, those clunky words out in a diary. Perhaps maintain a diary, bring those emotions out in a diary, and then use that material to create a short story or a poem or even a novel. So it's important to process your emotions, because after all, literature is about magnifying our emotions and presenting them splendidly well. So it's about that, but it's also important to process those emotions and to create a universe that is aesthetically appealing. And I think that writing a diary for someone like you might help in that process.
Thank you, ma'am. But how should, apart from writing a diary, how should I prepare myself for writing more methodically?
So that again is up to you. So once you've got all those difficult emotions down in a diary, that should prepare you to write more methodically. And also a certain amount of discipline that you impose upon your life, that you decide that I'm going to wake up at this hour and spend, say, 2 or 3 hours really writing something that is, really writing either a short story or a novel or whatever it is that you attempt to write. You have to tell yourself that you're going to, show up at your desk and produce that work. Without that discipline, I think it's very, very hard to create something that is interesting. A lot of very talented writers don't finish their novels, or they give up halfway simply because they lack the discipline to see that work, fully.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was a great series of questions, and the advice was also, I think a lot of us suffer from this or have this thing with their writing journeys. Thank you so much, Radhika, again. Okay, we now have Ananya Banerjee. If you have a question, Ananya, please go ahead.
Hello, good evening. Um, Hi, am I audible?
Yes,
I
you're
have
audible.
very bad
Yes,
luck.
yes.
Yes, great. Okay, so I remember you mentioned this towards the beginning of your talk that when we write, we tend to be inspired by events in our own life and tend to magnify certain events
Yes.
and, write a novella or something. Would you say that, and I say this from the perspective of creative writing, that most forms of creative writing are somehow always autobiographical.
Well, not most are autobiographical. I think everything is somehow connected with our lives, and we really mine our lives through material. Even a historical novel will have strands of something that's happened personally to you. You may be historically connected. Like, for instance, the 1984 anti-Sikh riots. I never experienced them firsthand because I was a little child, but I wanted to write about them because my grandparents experienced the 1984 riots. So you're always connected in some way to something that you really, really want to write. Having said that, there are dystopian novels. There are novels set in space. You're not, you don't experience space. It's not autobiographical, but that really is, it's also a very imaginative leap forward to write something that's not connected with your own life, and it's worth exploring as well. If you're interested in science fiction, and you want to move away perhaps from the claustrophobia of your life, then literature allows you that space as well. So you take that leap into another universe, into, like, The Handmaid's Tale. But The Handmaid's Tale is also an extremely feminist treatise. It's a very feminist book. It's dystopian, but it's feminist. So these are interesting interconnections that we find when we decide to write on a certain subject. And I think that we decide upon a certain writing project, we embark upon a certain writing project because we're emotionally invested in that project.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you again, Radhika. I cannot stress this enough. It was delightful talking to you and really a privilege. Thank you again to the very, very patient, interactive, and amazing audience we have here today. We couldn't have done it without you. Yes. So, as a last request before we retire for the day, of course, Radhika, if you have anything else to say to conclude the talk, please.
It was lovely interacting with all of you, and it was I think I've learned a lot about myself by chatting with you about writing processes and what inspires me. So thank you so much. I just hope that all of you will, that all of us have this tendency to give up on a project, but it's really important to see it through. So whatever it is that you start writing, see it through. It may be messy, it may not be good, it may not live up to your standards, it may not live up to Leo Tolstoy's standards, but see it through and then see where it takes you. So those are my concluding observations. Thank you very much. It was very enriching to talk to all of you.
Thank you again. Before we retire for the day, if I could ask the audience to please switch on their cameras for a moment so that we may have a few screenshots for the socials. Please don't be shy.
Lovely
Yes.
to see all your faces.
Thank you.
Ananya, we can't see Ananya.
Hi, everyone. Give me a sec, please.
Sure.
Yes, we have it. Thank you so much to
Thank
the
you
audience.
very much, and I hope to
Radhika.
encounter you, in the near
Yes,
future, all of you. Goodbye.
absolutely. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.